The human arrived at the Galactic Council chamber with a calm determination that drew quiet attention from those who had gathered there. Ships from countless worlds hovered in the skies outside, their hulls reflecting the soft lights of the nearby star. Delegates from different species moved gracefully, or in some cases, awkwardly, through the corridors, each representing the interests of their homeworlds. The human, by contrast, walked steadily, neither hurried nor hesitant, carrying only a small satchel of personal belongings and a notebook. Everyone knew that humans were unusual in interstellar diplomacy. Most species regarded them as observers rather than active participants. They were meant to witness, to record, to learn, and occasionally to offer neutral commentary. No one expected the human to influence any decisions or sway any negotiations. Upon entering the main hall, the human paused for a moment, allowing their eyes to sweep over the enormous chamber. The room was circular, with a high ceiling that seemed to stretch into infinity. Light shone through transparent panels, giving the impression of an endless sky above. In the center was a circular table, large enough to seat hundreds of delegates, each positioned according to rank and influence. The human's gaze, however, was drawn to the subtle details. The way some delegates leaned forward when speaking, how certain species avoided eye contact, the quick glances exchanged between allies. These were small gestures, almost invisible, to anyone not paying close attention. The human noted each movement carefully, silently piecing together the dynamics of the room. Other delegates were busy setting up their communication devices, adjusting holographic displays, and reviewing prepared statements. There was a flurry of activity as representatives whispered to each other in alien languages, their voices rising and falling like musical patterns. The human, however, remained seated in the back, observing quietly. Their presence was calm, almost unremarkable, but their mind worked at an astonishing pace, processing every piece of information that entered their awareness. While the others focused on their own strategies and speeches, the human was mapping the relationships, tensions, and alliances that would shape the outcomes of the discussions. As the first session began, a representative from a crystalline species spoke at length, their voice resonating like a series of soft chimes. They discussed territorial claims and trade disputes with a level of precision that impressed some, but bored others. Most delegates nodded politely, but the human noticed the flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of a few. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest that beneath the surface of formal statements, fear and doubt existed. The human made a note of it in their notebook, not as a judgment, but as an observation of patterns that could be important later. The room was filled with an energy that was hard to describe. Some species radiated confidence, their presence commanding attention without words. Others seemed timid, careful to avoid any gesture that could be misinterpreted. The human, as a spectator, did not need to assert dominance or show strength. Instead, they relied on attention, awareness, and patience. They listened to every argument, analyzed every pause, and watched every subtle shift in posture. By doing so, they could understand more about the underlying tensions than many of the experienced diplomats present. During a brief recess, the human walked among the delegates. Some glanced curiously, uncertain how to interpret a species that typically observed rather than acted. The human offered polite nods and soft greetings, showing respect but not seeking attention. In this simple approach, there was a quiet power. While others relied on displays of authority, the human gained insight by remaining unassuming. Small conversations revealed information that might never have come up in formal sessions. Doubts about alliances, fears of economic collapse, and unspoken desires for peace or for advantage. The human listened carefully, recording everything mentally, filtering it for what might become relevant later. One of the alien representatives, AI, tall being with shifting colors across its skin, leaned toward the human and whispered a question. The question was indirect, almost casual, but it revealed that even powerful delegates were curious about the human's role. The human responded simply, without revealing any intention or plan, maintaining the impression of neutrality. Yet in that brief exchange, the human subtly guided the other's thinking, prompting reflection without force. It was a skill that humans had long used among themselves, but rarely showcased on a galactic stage, influencing without confrontation, guiding without commanding, observing without interference. As the first day progressed, the human's role seemed increasingly contradictory to those around them. Officially, they were a spectator, meant to record and report. In practice, however, their presence was affecting the room. Delegates found themselves reconsidering statements, questioning assumptions, and adjusting tones when the human was present. Some species, known for their rigid adherence to protocol, showed signs of unease. Others, more flexible and adaptive, seemed intrigued, as if realizing that a new kind of intelligence had entered the chamber, one that did not rely on aggression, threats, or complex rituals, but simply on perception and reasoning. By evening, when the first day of the council concluded, the human had already built a subtle understanding of the entire situation. They knew which factions were vulnerable, which alliances were fragile, and where opportunities for resolution, or conflict, might arise. Yet to the outside eye, they had done nothing remarkable. They had not delivered speeches, signed treaties, or drawn attention to themselves. They had only observed, listened, and thought. And yet, in this quiet way, the foundation for what was to come had been laid. As the delegates departed to their quarters, discussing strategies and planning for the next day, the human remained in the chamber for a while longer. They reviewed their mental notes, organized observations, and considered the implications of every interaction. No one was aware that the decisions being made by others were already subtly influenced by the human's quiet presence. The human had entered the council chamber as a spectator, but by the end of the day, they had positioned themselves as a central figure in the unseen dynamics of the meeting. The night fell across the galaxy, and ships glided silently above the council hall, their lights reflecting on the polished floors. The human returned to their quarters, notebook in hand, and prepared for the challenges of the next day. They were still a spectator in name, yet their mind was already active in shaping possibilities. The room of power, filled with voices and ambitions, was now a stage where the human's observations would begin to matter in ways that no one, not even the most experienced delegates, could yet imagine. In that moment, it was clear to the human that true influence often did not require bold gestures or visible authority. Sometimes simply watching, listening, and understanding the forces at play was enough to change outcomes before anyone even realized what had happened. And so, the human ended their first day at the Galactic Council, calm, focused, and quietly ready for the days ahead. The next morning, the human entered the council chamber with the same calm demeanor as the previous day. The room buzzed with quiet tension, delegates from countless worlds preparing to resume discussions that would shape the future of multiple star systems. While most of the representatives focused on their prepared speeches and carefully rehearsed negotiations, the human's attention was on observation. They were no longer just noting gestures and words. Now they were looking for patterns, inconsistencies, and the subtle cracks that hinted at weakness or fear. It became increasingly clear to the human that one faction, known to others as the enemy, was struggling to maintain cohesion. Their members whispered among themselves, sometimes disagreeing quietly but never publicly. Their eyes darted toward other delegates with worry and uncertainty, and their statements, though carefully crafted, lacked the confidence of previous sessions. The human noticed all of this, not as a judgment, but as information, threads that could later be woven into a clearer understanding of the enemy's true state. While other diplomats assumed that humans were simple observers, the human had learned to read signals that others often missed. A pause here, A glance there, a hesitation in tone. All of these small actions revealed a story that was not being told aloud. During a debate over interstellar trade routes, the enemy faction made a subtle error in their figures, an inconsistency that could have gone unnoticed. The human, seated quietly at the side, took note of it, understanding that even minor mistakes could unravel larger arguments if presented carefully. Throughout the morning, the human engaged in small conversations with other delegates, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to test assumptions and gather further insights. One representative from a gaseous world that communicated through vibrations shared a concern about resource shortages. Another, a species of metallic beings, revealed anxiety over internal divisions. None of these conversations were confrontational. The human simply listened, asked gentle clarifying questions, and recorded mental notes. The other species assumed these were casual exchanges, perhaps simple politeness, but in reality, they were laying the groundwork for understanding the vulnerabilities of the room. During a formal discussion on territorial boundaries, the humans subtly influenced the proceedings without speaking directly. They asked questions, framed hypotheticals, and nudged the conversation toward points that forced the enemy to confront their weaknesses. One question, seemingly simple and neutral, caused the enemy to hesitate, their representatives exchanging uneasy glances. It was not a challenge, not a threat. It was merely a reflection of reality, presented in a way that the enemy could not ignore. This approach surprised many in the room, who expected that influence would come from forceful speeches or displays of power, not calm, reasoned observation. By midday, the human had gathered enough information to form a mental map of the council's dynamics. They knew which species were allied and which were only pretending to cooperate. They understood which delegates were insecure, which were overconfident, and which were likely to change their positions under pressure. Yet the human did not reveal any of this openly. To the outside observer, they were still the same calm spectator, taking notes and listening carefully. The subtlety of their approach was part of its power. By remaining unassuming, the human ensured that no one felt threatened or defensive, making it easier for truths to emerge naturally. A brief recess gave the human an opportunity to observe the enemy faction more closely. They watched as leaders whispered, as junior members fidgeted nervously, and as advisors debated quietly among themselves. The human noticed that the enemy was not simply unprepared. They were overextended, juggling too many priorities, and internally divided. Their resources were stretched thin, and morale was low. Even the most confident of their leaders appeared wary, as if aware that a single misstep could have serious consequences. The human made careful mental notes of these observations, considering how they might later influence discussions without ever raising their voice. When the council reconvened, discussions turned to strategy and negotiation tactics. The human continued their quiet observation, but now also began to plant small seeds of influence. They asked questions that seemed innocent or neutral, but each one forced the enemy to think carefully about their position. How would your plans change if a neighboring system refused cooperation? The human asked in a soft tone. It was a question that could apply to anyone, yet it directly challenged the assumptions the enemy had been making. Other delegates, expecting the human to remain passive, were surprised at the subtle effect of these inquiries. The enemy, however, appeared visibly unsettled. Throughout the afternoon, the human maintained this delicate balance, observing, listening, and guiding without asserting authority. They did not pressure, they did not threaten, and they did not take sides. Instead, they presented reality in a calm, clear manner, allowing the enemy to see vulnerabilities that had previously been ignored or hidden. By the end of the session, the human had not made a single overt move, yet the enemy's behavior had begun to shift. Their once confident statements were now cautious, their once assured tone now hesitant. It was a transformation that many in the chamber did not fully understand, but the human had anticipated it. As the day drew to a close, the human reflected on their observations. They realized that true influence often comes not from confrontation or power, but from understanding and insight. By noticing the small signs of weakness, by listening to what was said and what was left unsaid, and by guiding the enemy to confront reality themselves, the human had begun to shape the council's outcomes without anyone realizing it. Even other delegates, who had initially dismissed humans as passive observers, now found themselves reconsidering the human's role. That evening, as the council members returned to their quarters, the human remained seated for a while longer, reviewing mental notes and contemplating the next steps. They understood that tomorrow's discussions would be crucial. The enemy had vulnerabilities, and careful questioning could lead them to reconsider positions, possibly even to surrender. Yet the human knew that patience was key. Rushing, forcing, or revealing too much would undermine the subtle influence they had already established. Quiet observation, careful reasoning, and gentle nudges, these were the tools that would make the difference. In the quiet of the chamber, with distant stars casting soft light through transparent panels above, the human realized something important. Sometimes being a spectator is more powerful than being a participant. By understanding the forces at play, noticing the unseen, and allowing truth to emerge naturally, a single observer could influence outcomes far beyond what anyone expected. And in this case, the human's insight and patience were already setting the stage for events that could change the course of history for multiple worlds. As night fell, the human returned to their quarters, notebook in hand, but also carrying the invisible weight of responsibility. They were still, officially, a spectator, yet in practice, they were becoming an unseen force, quietly shaping the decisions of powerful leaders who had not even realized their own vulnerabilities. The human understood the importance of the next day and prepared carefully, knowing that the subtle influence they had begun to exert might soon lead to an outcome that no one, not even the most experienced diplomats, could have predicted. The morning of the third day at the council began with a sense of tension that was thicker than before. Delegates from countless worlds had gathered again, their faces reflecting a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The human, still officially a spectator, entered the chamber quietly, taking their usual seat near the back. Yet despite remaining calm and seemingly passive, the human's mind was alert and active, aware that today could bring a turning point. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, as if the galaxy were holding its breath, waiting for the next move to be made. The enemy faction was noticeably more cautious than on previous days. Their leaders whispered constantly among themselves, casting uneasy glances around the room, while junior members shifted nervously in their seats. The human observed all of this with meticulous attention, noting every gesture, pause, and glance. Every sign of hesitation was a clue, a window into the fears and insecurities that could now be used to guide the conversation. The human's role remained subtle. They did not speak directly to confront anyone, but instead prepared to introduce questions that would encourage self-reflection among the enemy. During the morning session, discussions focused on interstellar defense strategies. Each faction presented plans and contingencies, often using complex terminology that dazzled some delegates while confusing others. The human, however, looked past the words, focusing on inconsistencies in logic and hidden vulnerabilities. One of the enemy leaders described a strategy that sounded flawless at first, but careful listening revealed gaps in resources and support. The human took mental note, understanding that a carefully framed question could make the enemy realize the flaw themselves without any overt confrontation. When it was time for questions from the observers, the human raised a hand. It was a small gesture, almost casual, but all eyes turned toward them. The human asked a question that seemed simple, almost polite, about the feasibility of certain defense strategies if unexpected circumstances arose. On the surface, it sounded like a neutral inquiry. Yet the phrasing was precise, exposing a weakness that the enemy faction had been trying to ignore. The room fell silent for a moment as the enemy leaders exchanged uncertain looks. They had not expected a spectator to raise such a penetrating question, and they were forced to pause and consider the implications. The human did not push further, did not insist on an answer immediately. They simply observed as the enemy deliberated, quietly among themselves. The effect was immediate. The previously confident faction now seemed uneasy, their usual assertiveness replaced by caution and doubt. Other delegates, who had assumed that the human's presence was harmless, began to notice the subtle shift. The human's influence, quiet and indirect, was becoming apparent, though no one fully understood the depth of its impact. Later, during a discussion about trade routes and resource allocation, the human subtly guided the conversation again. They asked what seemed like an innocent hypothetical. How might the enemy respond if a key ally withdrew support unexpectedly? The question was framed as neutral and exploratory, but it forced the enemy to confront a scenario they had not seriously considered. Their hesitation was visible, their confident tone faltering as they realized the fragility of their current position. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, exposed not through aggression but through thoughtful questioning. By midday, the human had begun to notice a pattern. The enemy faction's decisions were increasingly influenced by their own fears and doubts rather than by direct arguments from others. Each question the human asked, each subtle point they raised, acted like a mirror, showing the enemy their own weaknesses. The human's presence remained calm, almost invisible, yet their influence grew stronger. Unlike traditional diplomats, who relied on forceful speeches, threats, or complex negotiations, the human achieved results through quiet insight and reasoning. During a brief recess, the human observed the enemy in private discussion. Their leaders spoke urgently, trying to reconcile internal disagreements. The human noticed how their allies argued over priorities, how junior members offered timid suggestions, and how advisors tried to cover gaps in knowledge. All of these small details revealed a faction that was not just cautious, but internally fractured. The human made mental notes, understanding that tomorrow's questions and observations could push the enemy toward a decisive choice without any direct confrontation. Returning to the council chamber, the human continued to plant subtle nudges. Each comment, each carefully framed question, encouraged the enemy to reflect on their own situation. One question asked what steps they would take if resources ran out sooner than expected. Another asked how they might respond if one of their key strategies failed. Each inquiry, though neutral in tone, forced the enemy to face uncomfortable possibilities. The delegates outside the enemy faction were astonished at how quietly and effectively the human was influencing the proceedings, while the enemy struggled internally, trying to maintain composure. As the afternoon session progressed, the human introduced a hypothetical scenario that would later prove pivotal. It was simple, yet precise. If the enemy continued their current course, what would happen in 5 years? The question was not an accusation, not a threat, and not even a criticism. It was a reflection of reality, designed to make them see the consequences of their own plans. The enemy leaders paused, their confidence shaken. They debated quietly among themselves, revealing cracks in their unity and growing awareness of the limitations in their resources and strategy. The human observed without interruption, allowing the enemy to reach their own conclusions. By the end of the day, a subtle but profound change had occurred. The enemy faction, once confident and assertive, was now cautious and uncertain. Their statements were measured, their tone hesitant, and their body language betrayed a growing awareness of vulnerability. The human, still a quiet spectator, had achieved what no forceful speech or threat could have accomplished. The enemy had begun to doubt themselves. Other delegates, witnessing this transformation, were amazed at the unexpected influence of a human observer. As night fell, the human returned to their quarters, reflecting on the day's events. They understood that true influence did not require overt action or visible authority. By observing carefully, asking the right questions, and guiding others to face their own truths, a single individual could shape outcomes far beyond what anyone expected. The enemy had begun to see their own vulnerabilities, and tomorrow, the human knew, might bring a turning point that would change the course of the council's deliberations. The human's calm presence, patient observation, and careful reasoning had already begun to reshape the dynamics in the council chamber. While they remained a spectator in name, they were quietly setting the stage for a transformation that no one could have predicted. The enemy, now questioning their own strategies and position, was on the path toward a realization that might lead to surrender. Not because of force or intimidation, but because of insight and reflection. In that quiet moment before sleep, the human understood the power of subtle influence. Watching, listening, and guiding through questions rather than commands was a strength few species appreciated. Yet here, in the heart of the galaxy, it was beginning to work in ways that would soon astonish everyone. The enemy, who had once appeared unshakable, was now facing truths they could no longer ignore, and the human, the supposed spectator, had orchestrated it all without raising their voice or making a demand. The fourth day at the Galactic Council opened with an unusual sense of anticipation. Delegates from multiple star systems entered the chamber, their faces betraying curiosity, tension, or quiet determination. But among all the beings gathered, the human's presence remained calm and unassuming, giving no hint of the critical role they had begun to play. While other delegates prepared their arguments and strategies, the human focused on observation and subtle guidance, knowing that today could be the moment when the enemy's doubts reached a tipping point. From the very beginning of the morning session, it was clear that the enemy faction was unsettled. Their leaders whispered nervously among themselves, exchanging anxious glances, while junior members seemed restless and uncertain. Even their tone during formal speeches had changed. Once confident and assertive, it was now cautious, measured, and carefully calculated to avoid mistakes. The human noticed every small shift, every hesitation, and every unspoken worry. These were not signs of weakness in the usual sense, but indications of internal struggle, which the human could gently influence without confrontation. The discussion opened with a review of interstellar trade agreements and resource allocation. Delegates presented their points with varying degrees of confidence, yet the human's attention was drawn not to the speeches themselves, but to the reactions of the enemy faction. A small misstep in one statement caused an advisor to frown slightly, a subtle movement that others overlooked, but that the human recognized as a sign of unease. The human quietly cataloged these observations, preparing to use them in a way that would guide the enemy to confront their own vulnerabilities. During a break in the session, the human approached a few neutral delegates, engaging in light conversation that seemed polite and casual. Through careful listening and unobtrusive questioning, they gathered further insight into the enemy's mindset. One representative, speaking without realizing the full impact of their words, revealed that the enemy's leaders had lost confidence in their ability to sustain long-term strategies. Another hinted at disagreements within the enemy faction over key decisions. The human absorbed this information silently, knowing that understanding internal fractures was far more powerful than any direct attack or argument. As the formal session resumed, the human asked questions that were seemingly simple but carefully framed to reveal truths the enemy had avoided. One question concerned the sustainability of certain trade routes if unexpected crises occurred. Another explored how the enemy might respond if an important ally chose to withdraw support. Each question appeared neutral and logical, yet it caused the enemy to pause, exchange anxious glances, and reconsider assumptions they had long treated as certain. The human's calm tone and impartial approach made these questions feel safe to answer, but they also nudged the enemy to reflect on their own weaknesses. By midday, it was clear that the enemy faction was facing a quiet but profound internal reckoning. Their leaders conferred in whispers, their expressions revealing worry and hesitation. The human observed from a distance, never forcing the conversation, never dictating terms, simply allowing reality to reveal itself. Through this indirect influence, the enemy was gradually arriving at the same conclusions the human had already understood. Their position was fragile, their resources limited, and their unity uncertain. It was a realization that could lead to surrender, not through intimidation, but through self-awareness and reflection. The human's subtle guidance continued during a key debate on territorial disputes. They asked a scenario-based question about long-term outcomes if current plans continued unchanged. The enemy leaders were forced to confront possibilities they had avoided: potential losses, weakened alliances, and the strain of overextension. Other delegates watched with amazement as the enemy's confidence visibly faltered. The human, still appearing neutral and calm, allowed the enemy to come to these conclusions themselves, a technique far more effective than any forceful argument could have been. Later in the afternoon, private discussions between the enemy leaders revealed just how far their doubt had grown. Advisors spoke in hushed tones, debating what measures could stabilize their position. The human had no direct role in these discussions, yet their influence was evident. The enemy's reflection on the scenarios raised during the council session had sparked uncertainty, which in turn created an openness to negotiation. For the first time, the enemy seriously considered the possibility of surrender, not because of threat or coercion, but because they recognized their own limitations and the potential consequences of continued conflict. As the council session drew to a close, the human's quiet observation and careful questioning had already reshaped the dynamics in the room. The enemy faction, once confident and unyielding, now appeared cautious, self-aware, and increasingly inclined to consider compromise. Other delegates whispered among themselves, noticing the transformation but unsure how it had come about. The human remained in their usual place, calm, seemingly passive, yet fully aware of the invisible shift that had occurred. By evening, the enemy faction gathered privately to make a decision. The human had not forced them, had not pressured them, and had not made threats. Instead, their questions and subtle guidance had allowed the enemy to see their own situation clearly, to recognize vulnerabilities, and to acknowledge internal fractures. The result was a deliberate choice: surrender. They would acknowledge terms that many had thought impossible to achieve without conflict. The human's quiet presence and insight had orchestrated this outcome. Though no one outside the private chamber yet knew the decision. When the news leaked to other delegates, shock spread quickly through the council. Never before had a faction so firmly opposed to compromise agreed to surrender without a single battle. Murmurs filled the chamber, questions flew, and speculation ran rampant. How had this happened? Many attempted to explain the unexpected result, pointing to diplomacy, negotiation, or strategic advantage. Yet the truth was far simpler. The human had guided the enemy to see the truth for themselves. Their calm observation, careful questioning, and patient understanding had created conditions in which surrender became the logical choice. The human, back in their quarters that evening, reflected quietly on the day's events. They understood that influence need not be loud, aggressive, or forceful. Sometimes, simply allowing others to confront their own realities, guiding them with insight rather than authority, could achieve results far greater than any traditional strategy. The enemy had surrendered not because of external pressure, but because they had recognized the consequences of their own decisions and limitations. The human's role, though subtle, had been central to this unprecedented outcome. In the stillness of the night, with the stars of countless systems shining beyond the council hall, the human considered the lessons of the day: observation, understanding, patience, and gentle guidance had proven more powerful than intimidation or aggression. The enemy's decision to surrender was a testament to the quiet influence of insight over force. And in that moment, the human realized that true power often comes from subtlety, reflection, and the ability to help others see truths they had been unwilling to acknowledge. The fourth day ended with a sense of awe and quiet triumph. The enemy faction had made a decision that would alter the future of multiple worlds. The human, who had been expected to merely watch, had instead reshaped the course of events through intelligence, patience, and careful observation. Their role as a spectator had evolved into something far more significant, a quiet force capable of achieving the impossible without a single overt act of power. The fifth day at the Galactic Council opened with a sense of history in the air. Delegates arrived early, speaking quietly among themselves, some with curiosity, others with disbelief. The news of the enemy faction's surrender had spread like wildfire, leaving many stunned. It was unprecedented. A faction that had once appeared confident, organized, and unyielding had agreed to terms without a single battle. All eyes turned, knowingly or unknowingly, toward the human who had been present as a spectator, a being who had quietly influenced the course of events in a way no one had predicted. The human entered the chamber with the same calm, measured pace as always. They were aware of the attention now focused on them, yet their demeanor remained composed, almost unremarkable. They had no desire for recognition, no need to boast. Their purpose had been observation, understanding, and subtle guidance. And yet, the results of their quiet work were evident throughout the council. Delegates whispered in amazement, attempting to understand how a species traditionally seen as passive had achieved what many considered impossible. The formal session began with the announcement of the surrender. The enemy leaders stood visibly tense but resolute as they read a carefully prepared statement acknowledging their agreement to the council's terms. There were no displays of weakness or despair, only an acceptance of reality tempered with dignity. The human observed quietly, noting the subtle relief on the faces of some enemy delegates, the cautious optimism among allies, and the silent curiosity of observers. Every emotion, every expression, every movement told a story that went beyond words. As discussions moved forward, delegates praised the peaceful resolution, highlighting the avoidance of conflict and the preservation of countless lives. Yet, beneath the formal congratulations, many were trying to understand the true cause of the surrender. How could a faction that had once seemed unstoppable and rigid change course so decisively? The answer, although obvious to the human, remained a mystery to the others. It was insight, patience, and careful guidance that had led the enemy to recognize their own vulnerabilities and limitations. During the remainder of the day, the human remained engaged in observation and quiet reflection. They did not speak unnecessarily, for their presence alone now carried weight. Delegates approached them cautiously, asking questions, seeking perspective, or simply acknowledging the subtle influence they had wielded. The human answered with thoughtful, measured responses, never seeking attention or acclaim, but providing insight when asked. Each interaction reinforced the understanding that true influence often comes from quiet wisdom rather than force or authority. Throughout the council, the human continued to watch the effects of the surrender unfold. The enemy faction, now committed to cooperation, began discussing terms and strategies for rebuilding trust and alliances. Junior members spoke more openly, revealing concerns that had previously been hidden. Senior leaders, once hesitant, now engaged with transparency, seeking to repair internal divisions and address weaknesses. It was a remarkable transformation, and the human noted every detail, understanding that the shift had not occurred overnight, but had been guided through careful observation and subtle questioning over several days. As the day progressed, discussions, moved to future plans and collaborations among the various factions. The humans' presence remained a quiet anchor, a reminder that observation, insight, and patience were as powerful as any treaty or strategy. Delegates began to consider new approaches to diplomacy, inspired by the humans' method of influence, achieving results without confrontation, resolving conflict without aggression, and guiding others to understand their own position through reflection rather than force. By afternoon, the Council had reached a consensus on how to implement the surrender and ensure lasting cooperation. Each faction now understood the importance of humility, communication, and careful planning. The human, though still a spectator by title, had become a symbol of effective, subtle diplomacy. Other delegates observed how the enemy leaders acted with newfound openness and willingness to compromise, demonstrating that insight and guidance could bring about change more profound than any display of power. The humans spent the final hours of the council reflecting quietly. They had not sought recognition, victory, or reward. Their goal had been understanding, careful observation, and guidance when necessary. And yet, the impact of their presence was undeniable. The enemy had surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they had been guided to see their own limitations and the reality of the situation. It was a testament to the power of patience, perception, and quiet wisdom. As night fell over the galaxy, the council chamber emptied, leaving the human alone for a moment to absorb the magnitude of the events. They had witnessed fear, confidence, hesitation, and ultimately, acceptance. They had seen how a species could confront itself and make a decision that changed the course of multiple worlds. The human understood that history would remember this moment, not because of force or aggression, but because of insight, calm reasoning, and the ability to guide others toward their own truths. When the delegates finally departed for their home worlds, the human remained a quiet observer, recording mental notes, reflecting on the lessons of the council, and considering how knowledge, patience, and gentle guidance could be applied in future situations. Across the galaxy, stories would spread of the human who had been expected to watch silently, yet had changed the course of events through quiet observation and subtle influence. In the days that followed, the human's actions were studied by scholars, diplomats, and strategists. They wondered how such a seemingly passive being had achieved results that armies, fleets, and traditional diplomacy had failed to accomplish. The answer was simple. The human had understood the power of perception, of asking the right questions at the right time, and of allowing others to confront their own truths. By guiding rather than commanding, the human had enabled a peaceful resolution that had seemed impossible. The story of the human at the Galactic Council became a legend, not for displays of force, but for the demonstration that insight and patience could reshape reality. Delegates from all corners of the galaxy would remember that a spectator, quiet and seemingly insignificant, could influence outcomes more profoundly than anyone had imagined. And for the human, the greatest satisfaction was not in recognition or reward, but in knowing that their careful observation, quiet reasoning, and gentle guidance had changed the course of history, bringing resolution, understanding, and hope to countless worlds. As the stars shone brightly beyond the council hall, the human walked quietly through the empty corridors, reflecting on the lessons learned. They had proven that influence did not always require power or aggression, that wisdom and insight could shape events in ways no one expected, and that sometimes the quietest voices could make the loudest impact. The galaxy had changed, not through war or force, but through understanding, patience, and the subtle power of perception. And in that moment, the human realized that the role of a spectator, when wielded with awareness and care, could be the most powerful role of all.